Welcome back to part 3 of our lecture series on regionalization, the geography of regionalization. And here is where we're going to start to get into the meat of it. So this is where I'm going to finally tell you what this map that I've used as the title slide to every lecture so far actually means. So, a little bit of a reminder, we talked about species distribution in the last 2 videos, and there's one distribution model in particular that I want you to remember for this video, and that's the endemic species. So remember that an endemic species is one that is occurring in one geographic place and nowhere else. Now, the endemic species distribution is very important for understanding regionalization because endemic species don't tend to occur randomly on the planet. They tend to overlap geographically. So that what I mean by that is you have a group of species that are endemic to Eastern Australia, and you have another group of endemic species that are endemic to Madagascar, and so on and so forth. So they different endemic species tend to overlap in predictable patterns. So in other words, we have different regions on the planet that have their own unique assemblages of endemic species. So the endemic species distribution is the one that gives us these provinces or these biogeographic regions. The cosmopolitan species distribution is not going to be particularly useful for identifying biogeographic regions because it's found in many different locations. But it's those individuals or those species that are restricted to certain areas that start to give us these biogeographic regions or provinces. So we have geographic regions that are similar in their endemic assemblages. These similarities in biota suggest 2 things. They suggest that these regions have related environmental and evolutionary histories, and they suggest that they have some present-day environmental similarity, for example, in climate or habitat. So we currently divide the Earth into 6 terrestrial regions based on zoogeography. There are marine regions as well, but we're not going to cover them in this course. But if you're interested, that's some extra reading that you can do. So we have 6 terrestrial regions. The continents are divided into 6 biogeographic regions based on zoogeography. So that means based on their assemblages of endemic animal species. Plants are separate. We'll talk about those in a minute. So 6 terrestrial regions. We have the Nearctic, the Palearctic, Neotropical, Ethiopian, Oriental, and Australian regions. These are the Slater-Wallace regions. So Wallace, you might recognize that name, Alfred Wallace. He was one of the key biogeographic figures who came up with these regions. So you see this map, there's these 6 regions. Now I'm going to tell you that sometimes what many biogeographers will do is they'll group the Nearctic and the Palearctic into one region. They'll call it the whole Arctic. So I want you to take a minute, again, pause the video and see if you can figure out why we would sometimes group North America and Eurasia. What is it about the history of Eurasia and North America that might have contributed to enough biogeographic similarity that we can group these 2 regions in some schemes? All right, so I'm assuming that you paused the video and you gave it some thought, and I'm hoping that you remembered from our lecture on the Quaternary period that North America and Eurasia were once connected by the Bering Land Bridge. So sea levels were much lower during past glacial periods, and we had a land bridge connecting Eurasia to North America through Alaska. So we know we have many examples of species in both regions that arrived from the other region by crossing the Bering Land Bridge. Our own species likely arrived in North America by using the Bering Land Bridge. So that is one of the reasons why there's enough similarities between North America and Eurasia that we can either separate them into the Nearctic and the Palearctic, or we can group them into the whole Arctic. Now, as you've probably learned through this course and other courses, scientists like to classify things, and we like to classify things hierarchically. So when we're classifying species, we have different hierarchies in our classification schemes. We have kingdoms, we have orders, we have genera, we have species. Same when we're dividing geologic time. We can divide geologic time into hierarchies. We can divide them into eons, eras, periods, and so on. And we do the exact same thing with our biogeographic regions. So we have our 6 major terrestrial regions, and within those major terrestrial regions, we can further subdivide into smaller biogeographic provinces. So Australia is its own biogeographic region under the Slater-Wallace scheme, but Australia itself can be further subdivided into different biogeographic provinces. We can do the same thing in North America when we talk about the boreal forest, the polar regions, the cool temperate regions. So again, it's the same style of classification schemes that we would use for dividing geologic time and for classifying species. So I made a point to mention that those 6 terrestrial regions, the Slater-Wallace scheme, is based on zoogeography, so animal distributions. And the reason that I mentioned it is because when you look at plant distributions and you try to identify biogeographic regions based on their endemic plants, the result that you get is going to be somewhat different. So regions of endemism in plants are different from regions of endemism in animals. And there's a few reasons for this. So one is that plants tend to be much more tightly restricted by abiotic factors. So plant species are very tightly controlled. Their distributions are very strongly related to soil conditions, temperature, and precipitation. Animals, you have more potential to see more generalism. Plants also have different dispersal mechanisms than animals do, and that means they're going to have different barriers to dispersal. So if you remember all the way back towards the beginning of term, which seems like 10 years ago now, we talked about dispersal and we talked about barriers to dispersal. And I made a point to mention that what is a barrier is relative. So what's a barrier to one species might be a corridor to another. So what might stop one species from distributing from one region to another is going to facilitate a different species to get from one region to another. So for example, a river is going to be a major barrier to a land animal, but if you're a fish, a river is a means of dispersal. So plants have different dispersal mechanisms than animals. They have different barriers to dispersal that gives us a different biogeographic classification scheme. And plants also have different evolutionary histories. So when we divide Earth into floristic kingdoms instead of the Slater-Wallace scheme based on animals, we do see a lot of similarities. So they're roughly similar, but we also see some key differences. So here are the floristic kingdoms that we currently classify on Earth. And as you can see, we've got the whole Arctic, the Eurasia, North America region. We still have the neotropical, like we do for animals. We still have Australia as its own region, but I want you to look particularly at the southern tip of Africa, Capensis in this scheme, or the sort of Cape Province that we would call it. So Cape Province is the smallest of the floristic kingdoms, and it's found at the southern tip of South America. And this small floristic kingdom is home to more than 9,000 vascular plants. And I want to draw your attention in particular to that area marked in gray, the Fynbos biome. I've shown it with the blue arrow. The Fynbos biome is a particularly diverse region within the Cape Province. So this is what the Fynbos biome looks like. It's a Mediterranean type ecosystem, so like a scrubland, semi-arid, fire prone, and it's known for its exceptional degree of biodiversity and endemism. So you can find more than 6,000 endemic plants in this small Fynbos biome. And almost 1 in 5 of plant species found on the whole continent of Africa are also found in the Fynbos biome. And if anyone drinks rooibos tea comes from a plant that is found in the Fynbos biome. So we have our biogeographic regions, and the boundaries between these different regions we call biogeographic lines. So these are areas where we have rapid turnover of many different taxa at the boundaries between our biogeographic regions. And these boundaries often coincide with geological barriers or climatic barriers. And these barriers are important because these are what prevent the dispersal of species between the bordering biogeographic provinces. So when you have a barrier, you have isolation of populations and species or communities on either side of that barrier. That's going to prevent gene flow. It's going to promote diversification. So those barriers are important for creating those biogeographic regions. So if you start to look at the boundaries of the different biogeographic regions, you can start to identify key barriers that are responsible or can be used to explain why those regions are different. So one example of a biogeographic line, one that divides Indo-Malaysia from Australia, is called Wallace's Line. So Wallace's Line, you can see it, it's the dotted red line on this map here. And this line is a very stark turnover in species between Indo-Malaysia and Australia. So you can have islands that are geographically closely located to one another, but have vastly different endemic species assemblages with vastly different evolutionary histories. So that tells us, because we have such a stark species turnover over Wallace's Line, that tells us there must be some barrier that's preventing dispersal. So when we consider the geological history of this region, we start to find mechanisms that help us explain what those barriers were. And what we notice is that Wallace's Line corresponds to a deeper, what's the word I'm looking for? An area of deep water where on either side of this line you would have had land bridges between the islands. So when sea levels were lower in geologic past, these islands in the Indo-Malaysian side would have been connected by land bridges, and islands on the Australian side would have been connected by land bridges. But because you have that area of deep water separating them with no land bridge when sea levels were lower, that kept those two areas separate from one another. So I'm just going to finish our discussion on barriers, I'm going to go all the way back to this first map that I showed you here, where you can see the 6 terrestrial regions that are divided based on zoo geography. And again, I want you to pause the video again, and I want you to look at the boundaries between these regions, and I want you to see if you can figure out what the barrier might be that is separating those regions. So the Oriental and the Australian regions we already talked about, that's Wallace's Line that separates them. But see if you can guess what separates the Neotropical region from the Nearctic, what separates the Ethiopian region from the Palearctic, and what separates the Palearctic from the Oriental. And I'm not going to tell you the answer in this video. This is something I want you to puzzle out for yourself. But we will be discussing the barrier or the geological event that gives us the Nearctic and the Neotropical in the next video.